Jack Turner, a 20-year-old college student, stepped into his father's modest suburban home after a grueling day at school. The warm glow of the living room lamp spilled through the window, yet the house didn't feel inviting to him anymore. Ever since his father, Stephen Turner, remarried, the place that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed foreign. The reason was Olivia Hayes, his father's new wife, a striking woman in her mid-40s who exuded a charm that made Jack uneasy. Stephen, a busy businessman who often traveled for work, had recently left for a 2-week business trip. That left Jack alone with Olivia. The thought alone made his stomach churn. Olivia was beautiful, confident, and carried herself with a self-assuredness that seemed almost predatory. Every word she spoke, every glance she threw his way, made him feel like she saw right through him. The first night Stephen was away, Olivia emerged from her room dressed in a silky cream-colored dress that fell just above her knees. It was modest enough to suit her role as a stepmother, yet undeniably seductive. Jack sat stiffly on the living room couch, his textbook open but unread. Olivia entered with a glass of wine in hand, her bare feet padding softly against the wooden floor. "Jack," she began, her voice smooth like honey, "it's rare that we get some time alone together, isn't it?" Jack looked up, his expression guarded. "Yeah, I guess so," he mumbled, keeping his eyes fixed on his book. Olivia sat across from him, crossing her legs slowly, the silk of her dress shifting ever so slightly. "You've grown up so much," she mused, tilting her head as she studied him. "You remind me of your father when he was younger." Jack forced a polite smile, his discomfort growing. "Thanks, I guess," he replied, quickly returning his gaze to the pages in front of him. But the words on the paper were a blur. He could feel Olivia's eyes on him, watching, studying, as though she were waiting for something. The tension escalated the next day. After hours at school, Jack returned home exhausted and decided to take a shower to clear his mind. The hot water cascading down his back was a small comfort, the steam surrounding him like a shield from the chaos outside. Suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open. Jack froze, the water still streaming down his face. Turning quickly, he saw Olivia standing in the doorway, wearing a thin robe tied loosely at her waist. "Sorry," she said, her tone casual but with a playful edge. "I forgot to grab a towel." Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Olivia," he stammered, grabbing a towel to cover himself. "You could have waited." Olivia's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Relax, Jack. It's not like I haven't seen a man before." She lingered for a moment, her eyes flicking over him briefly before she left, closing the door behind her. Jack stood there, his heart pounding, unsure if what had just happened was a misunderstanding or something deliberate. Either way, he felt violated and unsettled. That evening, Jack sat at the dinner table, poking at his food while Olivia seemed completely unbothered by the earlier incident. She was all smiles and small talk, effortlessly charismatic. Tonight, she wore a fitted black dress with a neckline that seemed intentionally daring, though she carried herself with an air of innocence that made it impossible to call her out. "Jack," she said, interrupting his thoughts, "could you help me with something? I dropped my spoon under the table." Jack hesitated, his fork pausing midair. Sure," he replied awkwardly, bending down to look for it. As he did, his eyes accidentally caught a glimpse of her legs, crossed delicately, her heels dangling off her toes. He felt a wave of embarrassment rise up his neck and quickly averted his gaze. When he handed her the spoon, Olivia's fingers brushed against his. "Thank you," she said, her voice light but loaded with undertones that Jack couldn't quite decipher. He excused himself shortly after dinner, retreating to his room. Alone in the dim light, he sat on the edge of his bed, replaying the events of the day. Everything Olivia did seemed calculated, but he couldn't be sure if he was overthinking or if there was something truly sinister behind her actions. The growing unease gnawed at him. Deep down, Jack knew that Olivia was testing boundaries, and he was stuck in a game he didn't want to play. Jack spent the next few days trying to avoid Olivia as much as possible. He left for school early and stayed late, finding excuses to linger at the library or grab a coffee just to minimize his time at home. But every evening, like clockwork, Olivia was there, her presence unavoidable. She had an uncanny ability to appear exactly when he thought he could let his guard down. One evening, Jack came home late after a long group study session. He found the house unusually quiet. The lights were dimmed, and the faint sound of soft jazz music drifted from the living room. Jack's brow furrowed as he stepped inside, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Jack!" Olivia's voice called out, smooth and inviting. He turned toward the living room and froze. She was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, wearing a satin nightgown that clung to her figure. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, and her lips curled into a knowing smile when she saw his stunned expression. "Long day?" she asked, patting the cushion beside her. "Come, sit with me. Let's relax for a bit." Jack hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to make an excuse and leave. "I think I'll just head to bed," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "Nonsense," Olivia said, her tone playful but firm. "It's just us here. There's no need to be so formal." Reluctantly, Jack sat down on the edge of the couch, careful to keep as much distance as possible. Olivia leaned back, her eyes scanning him with a mix of amusement and something darker. "You know," she began, swirling her wine glass lazily, "I can't figure you out, Jack. You're so quiet, so reserved. But I bet there's more to you than you let on." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just focused on school," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Olivia laughed softly, a low, melodic sound that seemed to fill the room. "Focused? That's a good quality," she said, her gaze lingering on him. "But even the most focused people need to let loose sometimes." Jack forced a tight smile, not trusting himself to respond. Olivia set her glass down on the coffee table and leaned closer, her perfume enveloping him. "You remind me of Stephen when we first met," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "So serious, so determined. But once he let me in, he couldn't get enough." The implication in her words made Jack's stomach churn. He stood abruptly, stepping back from the couch. I should really get to bed. I have an early class tomorrow." Olivia tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Of course," she said sweetly. "Sleep well, Jack." The following day, Jack tried to shake off the lingering discomfort. He told himself he was overreacting, that Olivia was just trying to be friendly. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the way she looked at him or the way her words seemed designed to unsettle him. That evening, Olivia's manipulations took a more calculated turn. Jack was in the kitchen washing dishes when Olivia entered, holding a sleek black dress in her hands. "Jack," she said, her tone light and conversational, "could you help me with something?" He glanced over his shoulder, wary. "What is it?" "I need your opinion," she said, holding up the dress. "Does this look appropriate for Stephen's business dinner next week?" Jack hesitated. Yeah, it looks fine." Olivia pouted, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Fine? That's all? Come on, be honest. Would you notice me if I walked into a room wearing this?" Jack turned back to the sink, scrubbing a plate furiously. "It's not really my place to say." "Oh, don't be shy," Olivia teased, stepping closer. She draped the dress over her arm and leaned against the counter beside him. "I value your opinion, Jack. You're young. You have good taste. Just tell me." Jack clenched his jaw, his discomfort growing. "It looks fine, Olivia," he repeated more firmly this time. For a moment, Olivia didn't respond. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "You're so serious all the time," she said softly. "It's adorable." Jack dried his hands and left the kitchen without another word, his pulse racing. He could feel her gaze following him as he retreated upstairs, her words echoing in his head. That night, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't deny it anymore. Olivia's behavior wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. She was testing him, pushing boundaries, seeing how far she could go. But why? What was her endgame? He thought about calling his father, but what could he say? That Olivia was being flirty? It sounded ridiculous. Stephen adored Olivia, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that any accusation would only make things worse. As he drifted into a restless sleep, Jack realized one thing. Olivia wasn't going to stop. She was playing a game, and whether he liked it or not, he was trapped in the middle of it. Jack woke up the next morning with a sense of unease gnawing at him. He couldn't ignore Olivia's increasingly bold behavior any longer, but the thought of confronting her felt impossible. Every time she looked at him, her eyes seemed to dare him to say something, knowing he wouldn't. That evening, Jack decided to stay in his room, headphones on, hoping to avoid her entirely. But avoidance wasn't an option when Olivia was determined. Around 10 p.m., a soft knock came at his door. Jack pulled off his headphones and hesitated before opening it. There she stood, wearing a robe tied loosely at the waist, her hair tousled like she'd just stepped out of a movie scene. "Olivia?" Jack said, his voice strained. "What do you need?" "My shoulder," she said, her tone light but with a subtle undercurrent. "It's been bothering me all day. I was hoping you could help massage it, just for a minute." Jack stared at her, caught between disbelief and frustration. I don't think that's a good idea." Olivia tilted her head, her expression softening. "Jack," she murmured, her voice taking on a feigned vulnerability. "I'm not asking for much, just a little help. Please?" Her tone disarmed him, and against his better judgment, he sighed and stepped aside to let her in. Olivia walked to his bed and sat down, pulling her robe off her shoulder to expose smooth, unblemished skin. Jack swallowed hard, his hands clenched at his sides. "Come on," she said softly, patting the space next to her. "I promise I won't bite." Jack sat down hesitantly, keeping a safe distance. He placed his hands on her shoulder, his movements stiff and awkward. The warmth of her skin beneath his fingers made him feel like he was crossing an invisible line, one he desperately wanted to stay behind. "There," Olivia said, her voice a breathy whisper. "Doesn't that feel nice?" Jack froze. Her tone wasn't one of relief, but something far more intimate. He pulled his hands away abruptly and stood up. "I can't do this," he said, his voice firm. "It's wrong." Olivia turned to face him, her expression shifting from softness to something darker. "Wrong," she repeated, standing up slowly. "What's so wrong about helping someone?" "You know what I mean," Jack said, backing toward the door. "You need to stop, whatever this is." For a moment, Olivia just stared at him, her eyes narrowing. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the warm, playful smile she usually wore. It was cold, calculating. "You're so naive, Jack," she said softly. "You think you're the one with control here?" Before Jack could respond, they both froze at the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Jack's heart dropped. Stephen wasn't supposed to be home for another 3 days. Stephen entered the house moments later, his suitcase in hand and a tired smile on his face. "I finished the trip early," he called out. "Figured I'd surprise you both." Jack felt panic rising in his chest. Olivia, however, was completely composed. She tightened her robe and smiled brightly as she walked into the living room. "Stephen, what a surprise!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. Jack lingered at the top of the stairs, watching as his father kissed Olivia on the cheek. Stephen looked up and noticed Jack. "Hey, kiddo," he said. "Why are you hiding up there?" I was just about to go to bed," Jack said quickly, his voice tight. "Nonsense, come down here," Stephen said, setting his suitcase aside. "Let's catch up." Jack descended the stairs reluctantly, his hands shoved into his pockets. Olivia's expression was unreadable, but Jack could feel the tension crackling in the air. They sat in the living room, Stephen obliviously chatting about his trip, while Jack barely responded. Olivia, meanwhile, played the role of the perfect wife, laughing at all the right moments and pouring Stephen a glass of wine. But Jack's silence didn't go unnoticed for long. "Jack, is something wrong?" Stephen asked, his brow furrowing. Before Jack could respond, Olivia cut in. "He's just tired," she said smoothly. "He's been working so hard at school. Isn't that right, Jack?" Jack opened his mouth, the words on the tip of his tongue, but fear kept him from speaking. He glanced at his father, who looked concerned but trusting, and then at Olivia, who watched him with a warning glint in her eyes. "Yeah," Jack said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just tired." That night, Stephen went to bed early, but Jack stayed awake, pacing his room. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to tell his father the truth, no matter how it sounded. Summoning his courage, Jack went to his father's room. He knocked softly, then entered when Stephen called out. "Dad," Jack began, his voice shaking. "I need to tell you something about Olivia." Stephen frowned, sitting up in bed. "What is it?" Before Jack could explain, Olivia appeared in the doorway. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with icy fury. Jack, she said sweetly, what are you doing? Jack turned to his father, desperation in his voice. Dad, she's been… Stop! Olivia shouted suddenly, tears welling in her eyes. Stephen, he's lying. He's been making me uncomfortable for weeks. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to hurt you. Jack's jaw dropped. What? That's not true. But Stephen's face had already darkened. He stood up, glaring at Jack. What are you saying? That you've been harassing Olivia? No, Jack exclaimed, his voice cracking. She's manipulating you. That's enough, Stephen bellowed. I don't want to hear another word. Get out of this house, Jack, now. The words hit Jack like a blow. His father's eyes, filled with anger and betrayal, were like knives to his chest. Without another word, Jack turned and left, his world crumbling around him. The cold night air stung Jack's face as he trudged along the empty streets, his mind racing with disbelief and anger. His father's words echoed relentlessly in his head. Get out of this house, now. He hadn't even given Jack a chance to explain. And Olivia, her performance had been flawless, her crocodile tears sealing his fate with devastating precision. By the time Jack reached his mother's house on the other side of town, he was numb from both the cold and his spiraling emotions. Linda Howard, his mother, lived alone in a modest, slightly run-down house. Since her divorce from Stephen, she'd retreated into a quieter, more isolated life. Jack hadn't visited often, but now she was the only person he could turn to. Jack knocked on the door, his fists trembling. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Linda appeared, her expression shifting from surprise to concern when she saw him. Jack, what's going on? She asked, ushering him inside. It's late. Why are you here? Jack collapsed onto the worn-out sofa, burying his face in his hands. It's Olivia, he muttered. I don't know how to explain it, but she's been messing with me. Dad thinks it's my fault. He kicked me out. Linda's brows knit together as she sat across from him. Olivia, she repeated, her voice cautious. What do you mean messing with you? Jack took a deep breath and told her everything. Olivia's flirtatious comments, her calculated attempts to manipulate him, and the way she twisted the truth to turn Stephen against him. When he finished, Linda's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrest tightly. Mom, Jack said, his voice shaking. There's something wrong with her. She's doing this on purpose. I don't know why, but… He stopped when he noticed her expression. Mom? Do you know something? Linda hesitated, her eyes flickering with unease. I didn't think it was her at first, she murmured. It's been so long. What are you talking about? Jack pressed. Linda stood and walked over to the fireplace, where a dusty photo frame sat on the mantel. She picked it up and stared at it for a moment before handing it to Jack. The photo showed Linda in her younger days, smiling brightly alongside another woman, Olivia. Jack's breath caught in his throat. You knew her? He asked, his voice low. Linda nodded, her shoulders slumping. We were friends, close friends, 12 years ago. Then why didn't you tell me? Jack demanded. Why didn't you say anything when Dad married her? Because I didn't know it was her, Linda said, her voice trembling. She's changed so much, and I didn't want to stir up the past. What past? Jack asked, though dread was already pooling in his stomach. Linda sank into the armchair, her gaze distant. 12 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I was out with Olivia one night, and I'd had too much to drink. She begged me to drive her home because she didn't want to leave her baby alone for too long. I shouldn't have agreed, but I did. Jack's heart began to race. What happened? I lost control of the car, Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. I hit a tree, Olivia's baby, her son. He didn't survive. Jack stared at her, stunned into silence. He'd never known about this part of his mother's past, and now everything began to make sense. Olivia hadn't just entered their lives by coincidence. This was personal. She blamed me for everything, Linda continued, and she was right. It was my fault. I left town for a while, trying to escape the guilt, and when I came back, Olivia was gone. I didn't think I'd ever see her again. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. She married Dad to get back at you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is all about revenge." Linda nodded, her face ashen. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to believe she could, but I should have known she'd find a way to hurt me." Before they could process the weight of the revelation, a loud knock echoed through the house. Jack and Linda froze, their eyes darting toward the front door. The knock came again, more forceful this time. Linda's voice wavered as she whispered, "Who could that be?" Jack stood cautiously and moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. His blood ran cold when he saw Olivia standing outside, her face shadowed under the dim porch light. In her hand, she held something metallic, a gun. "Open the door, Linda," Olivia's voice called out, calm but laced with venom. "I've been waiting a long time for this." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the door. "Mom," he whispered urgently, "she's armed." Linda's face went white. "She's going to kill us," she choked out. "No," Jack said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "She's not. We're going to end this, here and now." He grabbed his phone and quickly dialed 911, whispering the situation to the operator. But as he hung up, the sound of breaking glass shattered the tense silence. Olivia had smashed a window and was making her way inside. Jack positioned himself between his mother and Olivia, his body tense and ready. "You want revenge?" he shouted. "Then take it out on me. Leave her out of this." Olivia stepped forward, her face twisted with rage. "You don't get to make demands," she hissed, raising the gun. "You both ruined my life. Now it's your turn." The room was silent, the air heavy with tension. Olivia stood at the broken doorway, her face shadowed under the porch light. The gun in her hand glinted ominously as she stepped forward. "You think you can protect her?" Olivia sneered. "She didn't protect my son. She left me with nothing." Jack stood firm, shielding his mother. "You've already hurt us, Olivia. This won't bring him back." "Don't talk like you understand," Olivia snapped. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything." Jack's voice softened. "I don't. But this won't fix anything. You'll just add to your pain." Her grip tightened, and for a moment, the gun wavered. The sirens grew louder, filling the house. Olivia's gaze flickered to the window, panic flashing in her eyes, but her resolve hardened again. She pointed the gun at Linda. "No!" Jack shouted, lunging in front of his mother as the gunshot rang out. Pain seared through his side and he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. "Jack!" Linda screamed, pressing her hands to his wound. "Stay with me, please!" Olivia froze, the gun still in her hand, shock etched on her face. Police officers stormed in moments later, shouting commands. She dropped the gun and allowed herself to be handcuffed, her expression blank. Jack was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical but stable. After hours of surgery, the doctors assured Linda he would survive. When he woke, she was by his side, her tears a mix of relief and guilt. "You saved me," she whispered. "I couldn't let her take you away," Jack murmured weakly. Olivia was sentenced to prison for attempted murder. Her tragic past emerged during the trial, revealing a woman consumed by grief. While some sympathized, the court found her actions inexcusable. Linda confessed to the accident, accepting her role, and dedicating herself to making amends through community service. Stephen attempted to reconcile with Jack, but their relationship remained strained. Jack forgave him, but chose to move forward independently. He later pursued a career in counseling, helping others heal from trauma, finding purpose in his pain. Years later, on a quiet summer evening, Jack and Linda sat on the porch watching the sunset. The past lingered, but it no longer controlled them. Together, they found peace, proof that even in darkness, redemption was possible.